The wind was a thief, stealing the warmth from her skin and the hope from her heart. It scoured the plains, lifting sheets of dust that tasted of grit and finality. For 2 days, Elara had walked into that wind. Her world shrunk to the ache in her feet and the frantic, ceaseless prayer that her father would not follow. The dress she wore, her mother's last good one, was thin against the ceaseless bite of the air, and the small bundle clutched in her arms felt impossibly heavy. It held only a heel of stale bread and a silver locket, tarnished and empty, but it was the entire sum of her life before this moment. She could still hear the voices from 2 nights past, low and thick with whiskey, seeping through the floorboards of her narrow room. Her father's slurred bartering. The other man's cold, clipped replies. A name, Mr. Croft. Price. An agreement sealed with the clink of a bottle against a glass. A sound that had signed her life away. Bondage, they called it. Indentured servitude. But Elara knew the truth of it. She had seen the girls who went to work for men like Croft. They were ghosts in their own lives, hollowed out and used up until nothing remained. Her father, a man already hollowed by grief and failure, was now selling his only child to fill the void in his pockets. Her one desperate gamble was the name her mother had whispered on her deathbed, a name forbidden in their house for a decade. Silas, her mother's brother, an outcast who had chosen the solitude of this unforgiving land over the judgment of the town. A brute, her father had always spat, a man with no God and no softness. Now he was her only sanctuary. When she finally saw the faint line of his property, marked by a fence of strained wire and weathered posts, her legs nearly gave out. The ranch was as stark as the man's reputation. A small, sturdy cabin, a solid-looking barn, and corrals that were meticulously maintained. There was an order to the desolation, a purpose that her father's crumbling homestead had long since lost. She saw him then, a silhouette against the vast, bruised sky. He was mending a fence post, his movements economical and strong. He was bigger than she remembered, a broad-shouldered man who seemed carved from the same hard earth he worked. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. What if her father was right? What if he turned her away, back into the wind, back toward Croft? But there was no other direction to run. She forced her feet forward, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in the silence. He didn't look up until she was 20 feet away, his hand pausing on the mallet. He straightened slowly, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a winter sky, and they held no welcome, only a silent, penetrating assessment. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by dust and terror. I'm Elara, she finally whispered, the sound stolen by the wind almost as soon as it left her lips. He didn't move for a long moment. She saw a flicker in those gray eyes, a spark of something she couldn't name. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of a shared sorrow. He looked at her thin dress, the desperation etched onto her face, the small, pathetic bundle in her arms. He looked past her, back the way she had come, as if he could see the wolves at her heels. Then his gaze returned to her. He gave a short, sharp nod, not toward the road, but toward the cabin. Without a single word, he turned back to his work, picked up his mallet, and drove the post into the ground with one clean, powerful strike. The sound echoed across the plains. It was not a welcome, but it was a reprieve. It was enough. The days that followed unfolded in a quiet, measured rhythm, governed by the rising and setting of the sun. The cabin was Spartan, stripped of any ornament save for its own clean, functional lines. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its fire a constant, living presence against the chill. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot in the corner that was now hers. There was no softness here, but there was also no pretense. For the first week, Elara lived in a state of suspended terror, starting at every gust of wind, her ears straining for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She expected questions, an interrogation, a demand for explanation. None came. Silas moved through his world with a profound and unnerving silence. He rose before dawn, the smell of coffee and wood smoke his only announcement. He would leave a bowl of hot porridge and a mug of broth on the table for her before heading out to the barn, returning only after the sun had set, his face etched with the day's labor. He did not speak of her arrival, nor of the world she had fled. Instead, he gave her work. He pointed to a basket of his torn shirts, the needle and thread laid beside it. He showed her the small, wind-protected garden where hardy vegetables grew and the chicken coop that needed tending. The tasks were an anchor, pulling her out of the maelstrom of her own fear. They grounded her hands while her mind still reeled. She began to watch him, studying him in stolen glances. He was not the brute her father had painted. There was no cruelty in him, only a deep, ingrained solitude. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be gentle as he checked a newborn calf, the quiet patience with which he repaired a broken harness. He was a man who communicated through action, not words. One morning, she awoke to find a pair of sturdy leather boots outside her door, worn but recently oiled and mended. They fit her perfectly. She never mentioned them, and neither did he, but when she wore them into the garden, the solid feel of them on the earth was a comfort she hadn't known she was missing. One evening, as he cleaned his tools by the firelight, she took one of his work shirts from the mending basket and began to stitch a torn seam. He watched her for a moment, his hands still, the firelight catching the deep lines around his eyes. She felt his gaze but did not look up, her focus entirely on the small, even stitches, a tiny act of order in a world of chaos. It was a conversation held in the space between them, a fragile thread of trust being woven in the quiet. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. Here, in this silent sanctuary, under the watchful quiet of this solitary man, a different feeling was beginning to take root. It was not hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fundamental. It was the simple, profound feeling of being safe. The sky had been a threatening slate gray all morning, the air thick and heavy with unspoken promises. A storm was coming. Elara could feel it in the restless stirring of the livestock, in the way the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin like a grieving animal. She stood on the porch, wrapping her arms around herself, watching the dark, bruised clouds gather on the horizon. The churning sky was a perfect mirror for the dread that had begun to build inside her again. A rider. At first, he was just a speck, a dark mote against the pale dirt of the long track that led to the ranch. But the speck grew, resolving itself into a man on a fine horse, followed by another. Her heart seized. It was not her father's slumped figure on his old mare. The lead rider sat tall and straight, with an air of arrogant ownership. Even from a distance, she knew. It was him, Mr. Croft. The name was a shard of ice in her throat. She backed away from the porch railing, her hand flying to the cabin door, her first instinct to flee, to hide. The quiet safety she had begun to feel evaporated like mist, leaving only the raw, primal terror she had felt in her father's house. Silas emerged from the barn, a length of rope coiled over his shoulder. He saw the riders and his body went still. He didn't look at Elara, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent, protective field. He dropped the rope by the barn door and walked slowly to the center of the yard, planting his feet as if he meant to take root there. Croft and his hired man reined in a few yards away, their horses skittish in the charged air. Croft's face was smug, his lips curled in a sneer that did not touch his cold eyes. "Silas," he said, his voice carrying an easy contempt. "I'm here for my property. The girl's father and I have an agreement. A contract." Elara, clutching the doorframe, felt a wave of nausea, to be spoken of like a stray calf, a sack of grain. Silas remained motionless, his face unreadable. "She's not property." His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "She is my blood. She stays here." Croft let out a short, ugly laugh. "Blood or not, a deal's a deal. I have papers. You're harboring a runaway debtor. I could have the law on you." His hired man, a younger, meaner version of Croft, shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting casually toward the pistol at his hip. I suggest you step aside in that moment, watching Silas stand as an immovable bulwark between her and the man who would own her. Something inside Alara shifted. The terror was still there, a frantic bird beating against her ribs, but beneath it, a new foundation was settling, a foundation of anger, of resolve. Silas did not step aside. He took one slow step forward. "This land is mine," he said, and his voice had lost its quiet rumble. It was now the sound of rock grinding against rock. "The girl is my family." He looked from Croft to the hired man, whose fingers were now touching the butt of his gun. "Leave now, or you'll be buried on it." Before Croft could even respond, before the hired man could process the threat, Silas moved. It was a blur of speed and brutal grace. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his hand shooting out to grab the man's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crack of bone. The hired man screamed, his pistol clattering to the dust. Silas shoved him backward, and he tumbled from his horse in a heap of whimpering pain. Croft's face went pale, his smugness replaced by shock and a dawning fear. He looked at Silas, who now stood over the fallen man, his expression a mask of cold, absolute certainty. There was no rage in his eyes, but something far more terrifying, a complete lack of hesitation. Seeing this unyielding defense forged on her behalf, Alara let go of the doorframe. She stepped out onto the porch, then down into the yard, coming to stand just behind her uncle's shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her presence was a declaration. "I am here. I am not hiding. I will not be taken." Croft stared at the two of them, the silent, formidable man and the suddenly defiant girl. He pulled violently on his reins, his horse dancing nervously. He spat a curse into the dust, a final, impotent show of aggression. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice was thin, his threats empty. He wheeled his horse around, grabbed the reins of his man's mount, and galloped away, leaving his whimpering employee to stumble after him on foot. As their figures shrank into the distance, the first heavy drop of rain struck Alara's cheek. Then another, and another, until the sky opened and the storm finally broke. The rain came down in a cleansing torrent, washing the dust from the air and the tracks of their enemies from the earth. Alara and Silas stood in the yard for a long moment, letting the downpour soak them, the cold water a balm on the feverish tension of the last hour. The storm raged, but the true tempest had passed. Finally, Silas turned and walked to the porch, his movements weary but steady. Alara followed, her limbs feeling heavy, drained. They stood together in the shelter of the overhang, watching the sheets of rain turn the hard-packed dirt to dark, rich mud. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of survivors. "He won't be back," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It was not a guess. It was a promise. He had shown Croft the true nature of this land and the man who belonged to it. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers. For the first time, the harshness in his expression had softened, revealing a deep-seated sorrow. "Your mother," he said, his voice quiet. "She loved a good storm. Said it washed the world clean, made everything new." It was the first time he had ever mentioned her, the first crack in the wall of his solitude. He was offering her a piece of their shared history, a bridge across the silent years. In that moment, Alara looked out at the rain-lashed plains, and she no longer saw a wasteland. She saw the fierce, unyielding beauty of the place. It was not a gentle land, but it was an honest one. It did not coddle, but it did not lie. Like the man beside her, it was stark, powerful, and in its own unforgiving way protective. She had come here as a frightened girl, running from a monster, only to find a guardian in the one place she had been taught to fear. The resilience she had seen in Silas, she now felt stirring in her own blood. It was a quiet strength, forged in silence and tempered in confrontation. The world had tried to break her, to sell her, to erase her. But she was still here. She had a place. As the storm began to recede, the drumming rain gentling to a steady whisper, Silas pushed himself off the porch rail. "Have to check the livestock," he murmured, his usual retreat into duty. He started toward the barn, but paused when she spoke his name. "Silas." Her voice was clear, steady. The tremble that had lived in it for so long was gone. He turned back, waiting, his expression patient. The last of the clouds were parting, and a sliver of pale, clean light broke through, illuminating the damp earth, making it smell of sage and wet stone and new beginnings. This place was not a temporary shelter. It was not a hiding place. It was something more. She gave him a small, true smile, the first she had offered since her arrival. "I'm ready to go home now." A flicker of understanding passed through his winter sky eyes. He held her gaze for a long second, and then he gave a slow, single nod. It was the closest she had ever seen him come to smiling back. She followed him into the warm, dry air of the cabin, leaving the door open to the clean, renewed world outside.